Sarah Porter's wedding day was meant to be perfect, but when her closest friends and neighbors refused to attend, she was forced to confront the quiet racism lingering in her small town. What begins as heartbreak quickly spirals into something much bigger, as her story goes viral and ignites conversations across the country. How does Sarah find strength in the face of exclusion? And what happens when her town is forced to reckon with its hidden biases? Hit subscribe, drop a comment, and stick around to see how one woman's resilience sparks real change. Sarah Porter grew up in Fairview, a small town nestled in the rolling hills of the southern United States. The streets were lined with charming, well-kept homes, and the kind of friendliness that came with polite nods and neighborly smiles. For most, Fairview was an idyllic, close-knit community where time moved a little slower and life's greatest troubles could be solved with a pitcher of sweet tea on the porch. Sarah had lived here all her life. In many ways, she loved it. She worked as a dedicated school teacher, loved by her students, and she cherished the slow, predictable rhythms of her small-town world. She had a grace that drew people to her, an effortless beauty that went beyond her appearance and radiated through her kindness. Yet, beneath that surface charm of Fairview, Sarah had always been acutely aware of the cracks. She'd seen the subtle way the town's old habits still held sway, particularly when it came to race. Fairview wasn't a place where racism was loud or obvious. No, it was quiet and unspoken, lurking in side eyes, polite rejections, and the occasional discomfort at how different she was from the rest of the town. It was in the way some of her white colleagues would invite each other to dinner, but never extend the same invitation to her. Or how, when she was a child, she'd hear older neighbors whisper, "That Porter girl's nice for a black girl." Still, Sarah kept her head high, believing in the better side of people. She hoped that things were changing, that the world was shifting for the better, even here, in this small town, where change was slow but not impossible. Now at 33, Sarah was on the verge of marrying the love of her life, Ethan Wright. Ethan was a kind, compassionate man who worked as a doctor in the town's small clinic. They had met during one of the town's charity events 3 years ago, and their connection had been instant. Ethan, who was white, had never seen her as anything other than his equal, his partner, his love. Together, they built a relationship based on mutual respect, admiration, and deep affection. Their wedding was set for early summer in a beautiful garden outside the town. It was going to be a day filled with love, unity, and celebration of the life they were about to begin together. Sarah had spent months planning it, making sure every detail was perfect. She could picture it in her mind, her family and friends gathered, laughing, dancing, celebrating. It would be a day to remember. Yet deep down, a small part of Sarah worried. She had heard the whispers about her relationship with Ethan, though they were never said to her face. She knew some people still held on to outdated beliefs about who should and shouldn't be together. But she brushed it off. This was her wedding, her day, and she refused to let anyone tarnish it. The excitement was palpable as Sarah and Ethan sat together at the kitchen table, sealing envelopes and addressing wedding invitations. They had spent hours going over the guest list, making sure they hadn't forgotten anyone important. It was a carefully curated mix of family, close friends, colleagues, and even a few neighbors from Fairview. Sarah's face lit up as she carefully placed each invitation in its envelope. She had envisioned this day for so long, her wedding day, where all the people she cared about would come together in one place. "Can you believe it's finally happening?" she asked, looking over at Ethan with a smile. Ethan laughed softly. "I know. It feels surreal, doesn't it? But it's going to be perfect. Everything's coming together." They talked about the people they were most excited to see, the laughter they anticipated filling the air, and the joy that would surely be felt by all. Sarah's family was excited to come. Her parents, Gloria and William, had already called multiple times to ask if she needed help with any last-minute preparations. Ethan's family, though smaller, was equally supportive. But as the couple talked and planned, there was a quiet hope in Sarah's heart that her neighbors and colleagues would come too. After all, They were part of her life in Fairview. While she had never been as close to them as she was with her family, she still believed they would show up to celebrate this special day. The invitations went out, and Sarah was filled with anticipation. The RSVPs couldn't come fast enough. She could already see the wedding day in her mind, a gathering of love, laughter, and unity. A few days after the invitations were sent, the first RSVPs started to roll in. Sarah would check the mailbox eagerly each afternoon, her heart fluttering with excitement as she flipped through the stack of cards. Her parents were, of course, the first to respond with a resounding yes. Then came the replies from her closest friends, those she had known since childhood, from high school and her college roommates. But as the days passed, something began to feel off. More and more, Sarah noticed that her white friends and neighbors were declining. They sent polite, vague notes. "So sorry we can't make it, but we have a prior engagement." Or, "Unfortunately, something came up, but best wishes to you both." At first, Sarah didn't think much of it. People had busy lives, jobs, families, prior commitments. It was just bad timing, she told herself. But as the stack of declines grew, a knot began to form in her stomach. What started as a few seemed to snowball. Even Emily Thompson, a childhood friend she'd known since she was 5, sent a brief and formal note declining the invitation with a one-liner about an out-of-town trip. Sarah felt a pang in her chest. Emily had always been like a sister to her growing up. The rejection felt oddly personal, though she tried to brush it off. She couldn't let this dampen her excitement. There were still so many people who would be there, she told herself. But as the days passed, more white neighbors and colleagues sent similar notes. By the end of the week, Sarah could no longer ignore the sinking feeling in her chest. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of declined RSVPs. Ethan, noticing her quietness, walked over and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "What's wrong, love?" he asked, his voice soft and concerned. Sarah sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know. I thought more people would be coming. Look at this." She gestured to the stack of RSVPs. "It's like they're all finding excuses not to come." Ethan looked at the cards, his brow furrowing. "Do you think it's about the wedding, or?" Sarah shook her head slowly, biting her lip. "I don't know, but it's starting to feel like it's about me." Ethan squeezed her hand. "Sarah, no, it can't be that. Maybe it's just bad timing for people." But deep down, Sarah knew there was more to it. The excuses were too vague, too flimsy. It wasn't about the wedding itself or any scheduling conflicts. It was about her, and the realization stung more than she could admit out loud. I didn't think it would matter to them," she whispered. "I thought they'd want to be there, to support us. I guess I was wrong." Ethan wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. "You're not wrong," he said softly. "The people who truly care about you will be there, and that's all that matters." The polite declines didn't stop. Each day, Sarah checked her mailbox, only to find more excuses in neatly addressed envelopes. By the end of the week, she had a large stack of RSVPs that all said the same thing in different words: "We won't be there." It hurt more than she wanted to admit. She had been so excited to share this day with people she had known for years, her colleagues, neighbors, and especially the friends who had been part of her life since childhood. The realization slowly crept in like a cold chill. These people weren't declining because they were too busy. They were declining because they didn't want to come. Sarah sat on the porch one evening, the golden light of sunset bathing the town in a soft glow. She looked out at the familiar houses, the ones she passed every day on her way to work or when running errands. People waved politely when they saw her, but now those waves felt empty. They were the same people who had quietly declined her wedding, using shallow excuses to mask their true reasons. It was Emily's absence that stung the most. Sarah had grown up with Emily sleepovers, school dances, late-night talks about their future lives. Emily had always been part of her most important moments. And yet when it came to this day, the most important of all, she had turned away. That night, Sarah sat down with her mother, Gloria, at the kitchen table. Gloria was a woman of quiet strength, someone who had weathered the storms of life with grace and dignity. She had lived through the civil rights era, seen the world change, but also understood that some things, especially in a town like Fairview, didn't change as quickly as they should. "Mom," Sarah began, her voice shaky, "why do you think they're not coming, all these people? They said they would be there, and now they're just not." Gloria looked at her daughter, her eyes soft with understanding but tinged with sadness. She reached across the table and took Sarah's hand in hers. "Baby, I think you already know why," she said gently. "It's not you. It's what you represent to them. It's easier for them to decline than to confront their own discomfort." Sarah felt tears welling up. "But they're my friends. I thought they cared. I thought we had moved past all this." Gloria squeezed her hand. "Some people may smile to your face, but when it comes to stepping up, they'll show you who they really are. You can't take it personally. It's their failure, not yours." Sarah's heart ached, but her mother's words hit the truth she hadn't wanted to face. It wasn't just the wedding they were declining, it was her identity, and the love she shared with Ethan. The RSVPs had slowed, but Sarah's emotions were now a tidal wave, threatening to pull her under. One afternoon, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the stack of responses. It felt like rejection after rejection, and the weight of it was unbearable. Ethan found her there, sitting in silence, her hands trembling as she held one of the RSVP cards. She hadn't told him everything about how deeply the rejections were cutting her. Ethan had been her rock through all of this, always ready with a smile, always reassuring her that their wedding would still be beautiful no matter who didn't show up. But today, she couldn't hold it in any longer. "I don't know if I can do this," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I feel like I'm being punished for something I can't change, for something that shouldn't even matter." Ethan knelt beside her, his eyes filled with concern. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" She looked at him, tears spilling over. "All these people are neighbors, my colleagues. They're not coming, Ethan. Not because they don't want to, but because of me, because of who I am." Ethan's expression softened. "They're missing out, Sarah. They're the ones who are wrong here, not you." Sarah shook her head. "It's more than that. I've lived here my whole life. These people have known me since I was a kid, and still, when it comes to something like this, they just can't." Ethan gently took her hands in his. "This isn't about you or about us, Sarah. It's about their ignorance. They're afraid of change, afraid of confronting their own biases. But you're better than that. We're better than that." For a long moment, Sarah let his words wash over her. He was right, of course, but it didn't make the pain any less real. She had always known that racism existed here, but she had hoped naively, perhaps, that love could overcome it, that her neighbors would see her for who she was, not just as the black woman marrying a white man. The realization that they hadn't hurt her deeply. This was the first emotional climax of the story, the point where Sarah's idealism about her community shattered, and she was left facing a painful truth about the people around her. That night, Sarah and Ethan sat together on the porch, the stars twinkling above them like tiny lights of hope in the dark sky. Sarah's emotions were still raw, but Ethan's presence soothed her in a way that nothing else could. "We're going to have a beautiful wedding," Ethan said quietly, breaking the silence. "It's going to be filled with love and the people who truly matter. And at the end of the day, that's what's important." Sarah nodded, her heart heavy but starting to settle. "I know. It hurts. Knowing that people I thought were friends would rather stay home than be part of this." Ethan turned to her, his eyes soft but firm. "The people who love you, who truly care about you, will be there. And those who don't, they've shown you their true colors. But that doesn't change who you are or the love we have." Sarah leaned into him, feeling his strength, his unwavering support. It was moments like this that reminded her why she loved him so much. No matter what the world threw at them, they had each other. And that was enough. As they sat together, watching the stars and the moonlight shimmer across the fields, Sarah felt a sense of peace begin to creep in. Yes, the absences would sting, but they wouldn't define her wedding. The love she shared with Ethan was stronger than the hate, fear, or ignorance that kept others away. The day after their conversation, Sarah met her cousin Lily for lunch. Lily, 22 years old, was the complete opposite of Sarah in many ways, fiery, bold, and unafraid to speak her mind. Where Sarah was reserved and measured in her responses, Lily was outspoken, especially when it came to social justice. As they sat together at a small cafe, Lily scrolled through her phone, shaking her head. "I can't believe all these people aren't coming to your wedding. It's disgusting," Sarah sighed, stirring her coffee. "It's not something you can change overnight, Lily. It's how they've been raised, how they've lived their whole lives." Lily looked up, her eyes blazing with indignation. "That's no excuse. They should know better. And if they don't, then someone needs to call them out." Sarah shook her head. "I don't want to start a fight. I just want my wedding day to be about love, not controversy." Lily frowned. "But it is a fight, Sarah. You might not want it to be, but it is. They're not coming because you're black, and they don't want to face that. I think you should call them outlet people. Know that this kind of thing isn't okay." Sarah hesitated. She knew Lily had a point, but she wasn't sure if this was the right way to handle it. She didn't want her wedding to become a battleground for the town's racial issues. She just wanted to marry Ethan and celebrate with the people who loved them. "I don't know, Lily," she said finally. "I don't want to make things worse." Lily leaned forward, her voice softening. "You wouldn't be making it worse. You'd be shining a light on it. And maybe, just maybe, it would force some of these people to confront their own prejudices." Sarah looked at her cousin, torn between her desire for peace and her growing frustration with the situation. Lily was right. This was about more than just her wedding. It was about the quiet racism that had lingered in Fairview for years, the kind that people pretended wasn't there. But still, Sarah wasn't ready to push the issue. Not yet. The day had finally arrived, and the early summer sun was shining down on Fairview, bathing everything in a warm golden light. The garden where Sarah and Ethan had chosen to exchange their vows was breathtaking flowers, blooming in vibrant shades of pink, white, and lavender, with tall trees providing shade for guests as the ceremony was set to begin. The smell of freshly cut grass mixed with the sweet scent of the flowers, filling the air with a sense of serenity. Sarah stood in the small dressing room off to the side of the garden, her heart pounding in her chest. Her gown, a simple yet elegant white dress, hugged her in all the right places, and the veil cascaded down her back like a waterfall of lace. She looked at herself in the mirror, taking a deep breath, trying to steady the nerves that fluttered in her stomach. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," Gloria said, standing behind her daughter with tears glistening in her eyes. She carefully adjusted Sarah's veil, her hands trembling slightly with the emotion of the moment. "Thanks, Mom," Sarah whispered, blinking back her own tears. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, but there was still a heaviness in her heart, a weight that wouldn't go away. She had been trying not to think about the empty seats, but it was impossible to ignore. The RSVPs had been a painful reminder that, despite the love she shared with Ethan, some people just weren't ready to embrace it. People she had known her whole life, neighbors, colleagues, and childhood friends, had chosen not to come. But as she looked at her reflection, Sarah reminded herself that today wasn't about them. It was about her and Ethan, about the love they shared and the future they were building together. And the people who mattered most were already there, waiting to celebrate with them. "Are you ready?" Gloria asked softly, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. Sarah took another deep breath, feeling the tension ease just a little. "Yes, I'm ready." As the music began to play, Sarah walked down the aisle with her father, William, by her side. The small crowd of family and friends rose to their feet, their faces beaming with joy as they watched her approach. Sarah's heart swelled as she saw Ethan standing at the end of the aisle, his eyes locked on hers, filled with nothing but love. He looked handsome in his dark suit, his hair slightly tousled by the breeze, and the look on his face when he saw her was enough to make her forget about everything else. In that moment, it was just the two of them, their love radiating between them like an unbreakable bond. As Sarah reached the altar, she handed her bouquet to her maid of honor, Jessica, and turned to face Ethan. The officiant began the ceremony, his voice soft and warm, but Sarah barely heard the words. Her mind was focused on Ethan, on the way he looked at her like she was the most important person in the world. They exchanged vows, each word spoken with deep emotion, their voices trembling with the weight of the promises they were making. There were tears in Ethan's eyes as he spoke his vows, and Sarah could feel her own tears falling freely down her cheeks.
I promise to love you, to support you, to stand by your side no matter what, Ethan said.
You are my everything, Sarah, and I can't wait to spend the rest of my life with you. Sarah's voice shook as she spoke her vows in return, her heart overflowing with love for the man standing before her. I promise to love you, to trust you, and to walk with you through whatever life brings our way. You are my heart, Ethan, and I am so lucky to have you by my side. As they exchanged rings and the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan leaned in to kiss her, his hands gently cradling her face. The crowd erupted in applause as they kissed, sealing their vows with a moment of pure love and joy. For a brief moment, the pain of the absences was gone, replaced by the overwhelming happiness of the day. Sarah felt like she was floating, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The reception was held in a tent in the garden, with twinkling lights strung above the tables and a soft melody playing in the background. The guests who had come were full of joy and laughter, celebrating the newlyweds with heartfelt speeches, toasts, and plenty of dancing. But as Sarah and Ethan moved through the reception, greeting their guests and thanking them for being there, the empty chairs stood out like shadows in the light. There were spaces at the tables that should have been filled by friends and neighbors, by the people who had declined their invitations with polite but hollow excuses. Sarah couldn't help but notice the absences. She couldn't help but feel the sting of their rejection, even as she tried to focus on the love that surrounded her. There were moments when she would glance at the empty seats, her heart tightening with the knowledge of what they represented. She knew that those people hadn't stayed away because they were too busy or had other plans. They had stayed away because they didn't want to confront their own discomfort with her marriage to Ethan, with the life they were building together. At one point, as the night wore on, Sarah found herself standing off to the side, watching the celebration unfold in front of her. She smiled as she saw Ethan laughing with his friends, her family dancing together with joy. But the ache in her chest wouldn't go away. That's when Lily found her. "Hey," Lily said, coming to stand beside her. "You okay?" Sarah forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. It's just hard, you know." Lily nodded, her expression serious. "I know. But listen, Sarah, you're surrounded by people who love you. Look at all of this." She gestured to the dance floor, where the people who had come were laughing and dancing, celebrating the love between Sarah and Ethan. "This is what matters, not those empty seats." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know, but it still hurts." Lily looked at her cousin, her eyes filled with understanding. "I get it, but you don't have to carry that hurt alone. We're all here for you, and if those people don't want to be part of your happiness, then that's their loss." Sarah looked at her, feeling a surge of gratitude for Lily's support. She nodded, wiping away a tear. "Thank you. I needed to hear that." Lily smiled. "That's what family's for." As they stood together, watching the celebration unfold, Sarah realized that Lily was right. The people who were there, the ones who had shown up, were the ones who truly mattered. The love that surrounded her was stronger than the hate, stronger than the ignorance that had kept others away. But even as she reminded herself of that, she couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done. She couldn't let those absences go unnoticed. Not anymore. Later that night, after the reception had ended and the last of the guests had gone home, Sarah and Ethan returned to their small house, exhausted but happy. They curled up together on the couch, their wedding day finally behind them, and the reality of being husband and wife settling in. But while Sarah was ready to let the day come to a peaceful close, Lily had other plans. As Sarah and Ethan settled in, Lily took to social media. She couldn't stay quiet any longer, not after what she had seen. She posted a series of photos from the wedding, beautiful images of Sarah and Ethan exchanging vows, dancing under the stars, and surrounded by love. But she didn't stop there. In the caption, Lily wrote, "This was the most beautiful day, but it wasn't as full as it should have been. My cousin Sarah invited people she's known her whole life, people she thought cared about her. But they didn't show up. And it wasn't because they couldn't, it was because they chose not to. Because Sarah is black. This kind of quiet, subtle racism still exists in small towns like ours, and it hurts more than words can say. But today, we celebrated love, strength, and unity, with or without those who refuse to be part of it. Stand with Sarah. Lily's post went live, and within hours, it started to spread. First, it was shared by friends and family. Then, by people in the town. And soon, it reached beyond Fairview, catching the attention of people across the country. The story of Sarah's wedding, the beautiful celebration, the empty chairs, the quiet racism that had kept people away, began to resonate with others who had experienced the same kind of exclusion. Comments poured in from people who shared their own stories, offering support and solidarity. Stand with Sarah began to trend on social media as people from all walks of life shared the post, calling out the kind of quiet prejudice that often went unnoticed. The morning after the wedding, Sarah woke to dozens of notifications buzzing on her phone. She blinked groggily, still wrapped in the glow of her wedding day. Ethan was still asleep beside her, his arm draped gently over her waist. She reached for her phone, expecting messages from family and friends, congratulating them again on their beautiful day. But as she opened her social media app, her eyes widened in shock. There were hundreds, no thousands of comments, likes, and shares on Lily's post. The images from the wedding were everywhere, along with the caption Lily had written about the empty chairs. Stand with Sarah was trending, and messages of support were flooding in from strangers across the country. Sarah sat up, her heart racing. She hadn't asked for this kind of attention. All she had wanted was a quiet, joyful celebration with the people who mattered. But now her wedding had become a symbol of something far bigger. She scrolled through the comments, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. There were words of solidarity, with people sharing their own stories of exclusion and racism. Some of the comments were from people in small towns just like Fairview, describing similar experiences of being quietly shut out because of who they were. One comment stood out to her. "Sarah, your story is heartbreaking, but it's also inspiring. I've lived in a small town my whole life, and I've felt the same exclusion. Seeing you stand tall and keep going gives me hope. You're not alone." Stand with Sarah. Tears welled up in her eyes as she read the messages. It was overwhelming, both the support and the realization that so many others had gone through the same pain she had felt. She turned to wake Ethan, her voice shaking with emotion. "Ethan, look at this." He groggily opened his eyes and reached for his phone. As he scrolled through the flood of messages, his eyes widened in surprise. "Wow, this is huge. I didn't know Lily was going to do this," Sarah whispered. "But now, it's everywhere." Ethan wrapped his arms around her. "People needed to hear your story, Sarah. It's more than just a wedding, no, it's about all those people who've been quietly hurt by this kind of racism. You're giving them a voice." Sarah nodded, though her emotions were a mix of pride and uncertainty. She hadn't intended to start a movement, but somehow that's exactly what had happened. By mid-morning, the story had spread far beyond social media. Local news outlets picked it up, and soon national news stations were reaching out to Sarah for interviews. Reporters wanted to know more about what had happened, about the people who hadn't attended, and why. It wasn't long before Fairview found itself at the center of a growing conversation about racism in small towns across America. At first, Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. She didn't want to drag her wedding into the spotlight for something so painful. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that staying silent would only allow the quiet racism she had experienced to continue unchecked. So, after much deliberation, Sarah agreed to speak with a local news station. The interview was conducted in her home, with Ethan by her side and Gloria sitting proudly on the couch next to her daughter. The reporter, Megan Davis, was sensitive to the situation, asking thoughtful questions that allowed Sarah to share her story without sensationalizing it. As the cameras rolled, Sarah spoke from the heart. "I've lived in Fairview my entire life," Sarah said, her voice steady. "I love this town. But I've also experienced the kind of racism that doesn't scream in your face. It whispers behind closed doors. It's in the way people exclude you from their lives without ever saying why. And that's what happened with my wedding. People I've known for years, people who I thought cared about me, declined to come not because they couldn't, but because they were uncomfortable with who I am and the love I share with my husband, Ethan. Ethan squeezed her hand in support as she continued. What hurt the most wasn't their absence, it was realizing that their absence meant more than I had ever wanted to believe. And that's something that people like me, people of color, in small towns across this country, deal with every day. We're told we belong, but when it comes down to it, we're still excluded. The interview aired later that evening, and the response was immediate. People across the country reached out, sharing their own stories, while some of Fairview's residents began to squirm under the sudden scrutiny. As Stand With Sarah continued to trend, the people in Fairview who had declined the wedding invitations found themselves at the center of uncomfortable conversations. No one had named them in public, but in a small town like Fairview, it was hard for the community to figure out who had chosen not to attend. The whispers behind closed doors grew louder. People began to question each other's decisions, and those who had quietly stayed away from the wedding were suddenly faced with the reality of their actions. Some tried to defend themselves, saying they had legitimate reasons for not attending, but their excuses didn't hold up under scrutiny. A few of the absent guests reached out to Sarah, sending her messages of apology. Emily, the childhood friend Sarah had been so hurt by, sent a long, heartfelt email, explaining that she hadn't realized how much her absence would hurt Sarah, and that she hadn't intended for it to be seen as a rejection of Sarah's marriage. But Sarah knew better. She knew that Emily, like so many others, had chosen to stay away because it was easier than confronting her own discomfort. The apologies, while sincere, couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. Even the mayor of Fairview, Tom Hartwell, made a statement during a town meeting, addressing the sudden attention the town was receiving. We need to acknowledge that racism, even in its most subtle forms, still exists in our community, he said, standing at the podium with a somber expression. This is a moment for reflection and for us to do better. Sarah's story has shone a light on something we can no longer ignore. Not everyone in town was willing to reflect, though. Some residents pushed back against the idea that racism was still an issue in Fairview, refusing to acknowledge their own biases. But others, especially younger people like Lily, began to speak out more openly about the need for change. In the midst of the media frenzy, Sarah found herself feeling strangely calm. The initial shock of the attention had worn off, and now she felt a deep sense of purpose. Her wedding had become more than just a celebration of love, it had become a catalyst for conversations that had long been avoided in Fairview. She didn't need the apologies from the people who hadn't shown up. Their absence had spoken louder than any words they could offer. Instead, Sarah focused on the love that had surrounded her on her wedding day, the family, friends, and community members who had been there to support her and Ethan. As the days passed, Sarah continued to receive messages of support from people all over the country. Some shared their own experiences of being excluded or marginalized, while others simply wanted to let her know how much her story had inspired them. One message in particular stood out to Sarah. It was from a woman named Carla, who lived in a small town in Texas. She had grown up feeling excluded because of her race, just like Sarah, and had never fully confronted the quiet racism that had shaped her life. "Seeing your story gave me the courage to finally speak up," Carla wrote. "I've been silent for too long, but now I know that my voice matters. Thank you for standing up for all of us." Sarah smiled as she read the message. It was moments like this that reminded her why she had decided to speak out. Her story wasn't just about her wedding anymore. It was about giving a voice to all the people who had been quietly hurt by the same kind of exclusion. Weeks passed, and the media attention began to die down, but the conversations in Fairview continued. Some people in the town began to reflect on their own behavior, while others remained resistant to change. But Sarah no longer felt weighed down by the opinions of those who had chosen to stay away from her wedding. She and Ethan continued to build their life together, stronger for having faced the challenges that had come their way. Their love had been tested, but it had come out even more resilient. They focused on their future, on the family they wanted to build, and on the life they wanted to create together. One afternoon, as Sarah sat on the porch with Ethan, looking out at the familiar streets of Fairview, she felt a deep sense of peace. The town still had a long way to go, but she knew that change was possible. And even if it came slowly, she would continue to stand tall, just as she always had. "They didn't need to be there," Sarah said softly, leaning into Ethan's embrace. "No, they didn't," he agreed, kissing the top of her head. "We've got everything we need right here." Sarah smiled, closing her eyes as she rested her head on his shoulder. Her life was full, her heart was strong, and she knew that no matter what came next, she was ready for it. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to let anyone silence it again. Several weeks after the wedding, things had quieted down. The flurry of media attention had mostly passed, though the conversations it sparked still echoed through Fairview. The town wasn't the same as before, not completely. Some people had begun to confront the truth about themselves and their role in maintaining an environment of exclusion, while others continued to resist, clinging to their outdated beliefs. One afternoon, as Sarah sat in her living room reading through more messages of support, there was a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, but she had a feeling she knew who it was. When she opened the door, standing there, with eyes cast downward and a bouquet of flowers clutched nervously in her hands, was Emily, her childhood friend, who had declined the wedding invitation. Emily's face was flushed with embarrassment, and her voice trembled slightly as she began to speak. "Sarah," Emily said softly, "I'm so sorry." Sarah stood there for a moment, watching Emily carefully. She had thought about this moment for weeks, ever since the RSVPs started coming in, and Emily's absence had cut deeper than any of the others. Part of her had dreaded this conversation, while another part of her had hoped it would happen. "I didn't realize how much it would hurt you," Emily continued, her eyes beginning to well up with tears. "I didn't come to the wedding because I guess I didn't want to confront how I was feeling. I didn't want to admit that I was uncomfortable. But now, after everything that's happened, I see how wrong I was. And I'm so sorry for not being there for you when it mattered most." Sarah felt a knot form in her throat. Hearing Emily's apology stirred up so many conflicting emotions. She had been angry, yes, but mostly she had been hurt. Hurt by someone she thought had understood her. Someone who should have been by her side. Emily's hands shook as she held out the bouquet of flowers. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted to come here and tell you how sorry I am in person." Sarah sighed, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at Emily, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. Part of her wanted to shut the door, to walk away and never look back. But another part of her, the part that had always believed people could change, hesitated. "It wasn't just about you not coming to the wedding, Emily," Sarah said finally, her voice calm but firm. "It was about what that meant. You were my friend for years, and when it came time to support me, you chose not to. And that hurt more than anything." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, and I can't undo what I did. But I want to do better. I want to be better." Sarah looked at her for a long moment, then reached out and took the bouquet from her trembling hands. "I hope you do, Emily. I hope you do." Emily's shoulders sagged in relief, though the tears still flowed freely. "Thank you, Sarah," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me a chance." With that, Emily turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing at the door, holding the bouquet. The confrontation had been difficult, but as Sarah watched Emily disappear down the street, she felt a strange sense of closure. Not because Emily had apologized, but because Sarah had finally accepted that some people would change, and others wouldn't. And either way, it was okay. In the weeks that followed, Sarah and Ethan settled into their new life as husband and wife. The whirlwind of the wedding and its aftermath had passed, leaving them with a quieter, more peaceful existence. They focused on their careers, Sarah with her teaching, and Ethan with his work at the clinic, and began to dream about their future together. Fairview, too, had begun to change in small but significant ways. Conversations about race, Exclusion and community were happening more openly than they ever had before. Younger generations, inspired by what had happened at Sarah's wedding, were pushing for change, for greater inclusivity and understanding. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a start. Sarah found herself invited to speak at community events, to share her story and talk about how Fairview could move forward. She accepted some of the invitations, though she was careful not to make herself the center of attention. For Sarah, the goal wasn't to stay in the spotlight. It was to ensure that the conversations continued, even after the media had moved on. One evening, as Sarah and Ethan sat on the porch of their home, sipping iced tea and watching the sunset, Ethan turned to her with a soft smile. "You know, I'm really proud of you," he said, his voice full of affection. Sarah raised an eyebrow, a teasing smile playing at her lips. "For what, marrying you?" Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "For standing up. For being brave enough to speak your truth, even when it was hard. You've helped change this town, Sarah." Sarah smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I didn't do it alone," she said quietly. "I had you, and Lily, and my family." Ethan squeezed her hand. "And now, you've got a whole community behind you." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, letting his words sink in. It had been a long journey, and there were still battles ahead. But for now, she felt at peace. The people who truly loved her had shown up, and the rest, they had been forced to confront their own choices. Whether they changed or not was up to them, but Sarah no longer carried the weight of their absence. "I think we're going to be okay," Sarah said softly, lifting her head to look at Ethan. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "We're more than okay. We're stronger because of it." Sarah nodded, feeling the truth of his words deep in her heart. They were stronger. Their love had been tested in ways they hadn't expected, but it had only grown more resilient. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of gold and pink, Sarah felt a deep sense of contentment. She had found her voice, and with it, she had found peace. The love that surrounded her was enough. It always had been. Months later, long after the wedding had passed, Sarah and Ethan sat in their living room, flipping through their wedding album. The photos captured the beauty of the day, the flowers, the smiles, the laughter. But what struck Sarah most was the warmth in the faces of the people who had been there, the ones who had stood by her side through it all. As they looked through the album, Sarah received a message on her phone. It was from Carla, the woman from Texas who had reached out to Sarah after her story went viral. The message read, "I just wanted to let you know that I stood up for myself today. For the first time, I didn't stay silent when someone made me feel less than. Your story gave me the courage to speak up. Thank you for being so brave. Stand with Sarah." Sarah smiled as she read the message, her heart swelling with pride. It was moments like this that reminded her that her story had made a difference, not just for her, but for others too. She looked over at Ethan, her hand resting on his arm. "It wasn't just about the wedding," she said softly. "It was about so much more." Ethan nodded, understanding the depth of what she meant. It always was. Together they closed the wedding album and set it aside. The memories of that day were etched in their hearts, but now it was time to move forward, to continue building their life together, full of love, resilience, and the strength they had found in each other. And as they walked hand in hand into their future, Sarah knew that no matter what came their way, they would face it together, stronger than ever. As months passed, the conversations in Fairview persisted, though the media attention had long since shifted to other stories. But Sarah's wedding and the Stand with Sarah movement continued to have an impact in small but noticeable ways. The ripple effect of her story wasn't just confined to social media or viral hashtags, it was present in the subtle shifts happening around her town. One day, as Sarah walked through the local grocery store, she noticed something different. People who had once looked away or given her hesitant smiles were now more open. They nodded warmly or greeted her, sometimes even stopping to chat. It wasn't everyone, of course, but the atmosphere felt different. Conversations seemed to flow more naturally, as if a layer of pretense had been stripped away. Even at work, Sarah sensed a shift. Some of her colleagues, those who had remained distant or uncomfortable, were making efforts to engage with her more sincerely. Melissa, a teacher who had initially declined Sarah's wedding invitation with a vague excuse, now greeted her warmly every morning. Melissa had even invited Sarah to a small gathering at her house, a gesture that seemed to signify her desire to repair the distance between them. Sarah had to admit that she wasn't entirely sure how to feel about these changes. While she appreciated the efforts people were making, she knew that for many of them, their attitudes were still evolving. It was progress, but it was slow, and Sarah understood that true change wouldn't happen overnight.
Still, the fact that people were trying at all gave her hope.
One afternoon, Sarah was surprised to receive a phone call from Mayor Tom Hartwell, asking if he could meet with her. She hadn't spoken to the mayor directly since the town meeting where he had addressed the attention brought on by her wedding, and she was curious to know why he wanted to speak now. When the mayor arrived at her house, he was polite and professional, though Sarah could see the nervousness in his demeanor. He wasn't a man used to confronting these kinds of issues, especially ones so closely tied to race. They sat on her porch, sipping iced tea as the summer heat lingered. "Sarah," Mayor Hartwell began, clearing his throat, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened since your wedding. I'll admit, when the story first broke, I didn't fully understand the weight of it. But now, after seeing the impact it's had, not just in our town but beyond, I realize we have work to do." Sarah listened carefully, unsure of where he was going with this. "I've been talking with some of the town council members," he continued, "and we think it's time to address some of the deeper issues in Fairview issues that we've ignored for too long. I wanted to see if you would be interested in helping us lead those discussions." Sarah raised an eyebrow, surprised by his request. "You want me to help?" Mayor Hartwell nodded. "You've become a voice for change whether you meant to or not. People are listening to you, and I think you could help bridge the gap between the old ways of thinking and what we're trying to move toward." Sarah sat back, considering his words. She hadn't sought out this role, and part of her was hesitant to take it on. She didn't want to be seen as the face of every conversation about race in Fairview. But at the same time, she understood the importance of the opportunity in front of her. "Mayor Hartwell," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this can't just be about me. If we're going to have real conversations about race and change, we need more voices from people of color across the town, and those who have been directly affected by these issues for years." The mayor nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. We need a diverse group of people involved. I'm not asking you to take this on alone, but I think your insight could help guide the process." Sarah took a deep breath, weighing her options. She didn't want to be thrust into the spotlight again, but if this could lead to meaningful change in her community, she knew she couldn't walk away. "All right," she said finally. "I'll help, but only if it's a true collaboration. This can't be just about one person's experience." Mayor Hartwell smiled, relieved. "Thank you, Sarah. I really think we can make a difference here." As the mayor left, Sarah felt a sense of purpose growing within her. She hadn't asked for this responsibility, but now that it was in front of her, she couldn't ignore it. If her story could lead to real change in Fairview, she would do whatever she could to help. In the weeks that followed, Sarah found herself at the center of several town hall meetings focused on inclusion, diversity, and building a more inclusive community in Fairview. It wasn't always easy. The meetings were sometimes tense, with some older residents resisting the idea that Fairview had a problem with racism at all. But others, especially the younger generation, were eager to have these discussions, and Sarah could see the beginnings of something real. One of the most impactful moments came during a meeting when a local shop owner, Mr. Darrell Harris, an elderly black man who had lived in Fairview his entire life, stood up to speak. He hadn't spoken much during previous meetings, preferring to listen quietly from the back of the room. But on this night, Mr. Harris cleared his throat and addressed the room. "I've been here a long time," he said in his deep, gravelly voice. "Long enough to see things change, and long enough to see some things stay the same. What happened with Sarah's wedding wasn't new. It's been happening in this town for generations, just in different ways." The room fell silent, all eyes on Mr. Harris as he continued. "But what's new," he said, glancing at Sarah with a knowing look, is that people are finally talking about it. And that's a start. It's not going to fix everything, but it's a step in the right direction. And sometimes that's all you need to begin. His words resonated deeply with Sarah, and she saw nods of agreement around the room. The conversations were difficult, but they were necessary. And for the first time, Sarah felt hopeful that Fairview was on the path to becoming the kind of town she had always believed it could be. One evening, Sarah received a letter in the mail from her cousin Lily. It was rare for Lily to write a letter. She usually preferred texting or calling, but this felt special, personal. The letter was short, but it carried a lot of weight. Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened since the wedding. I've seen how much you've handled with grace, even when it's been hard, and I just want to say how proud I am of you. You didn't ask for any of this, but you took it on, and you've made a real difference. You've always been the strong one, but now the whole world gets to see that. Keep going, Sarah. Keep being you. Love, Lily? Sarah smiled as she read the letter, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Lily had been her fiercest supporter from the beginning, and now, with this simple note, she reminded Sarah of the power of their bond. Sarah wasn't alone in this fight, she never had been. The seasons changed, and as the cool autumn air began to settle over Fairview, Sarah and Ethan's life settled into a new rhythm. They were planning their future, discussing starting a family, growing their careers, and continuing to contribute to the community in meaningful ways. Fairview, too, was beginning to change. The conversations that had started after the wedding were still ongoing, and while progress was slow, it was real. Small steps had been taken, more diverse community events, inclusive town initiatives, and a growing openness among residents to talk about difficult issues. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One afternoon, as Sarah and Ethan took a walk through the town, they passed the garden where their wedding had taken place. The memories of that day, both the joy and the pain, came flooding back. But this time, Sarah felt at peace. They didn't need to be there, Sarah said softly, echoing the words she had spoken before. Ethan smiled, pulling her close. No, they didn't. But look how far we've come. Sarah nodded, feeling a sense of contentment she hadn't felt in a long time. The journey had been difficult, but it had also been transformative. Her story had sparked a change not just in Fairview, but in herself. As they continued their walk hand in hand, Sarah knew that they were ready for whatever came next. Together, they had faced the world, and together, they would continue to move forward, one step at a time. As the story draws to a close and the screen fades to black, the narrator's voice returns, calm but encouraging. If you enjoyed this story of love, resilience, and the power of community, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more inspiring stories like this one. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Together, we can keep sharing these powerful messages and stand up for what's right. Thank you for watching. But it was a start, and sometimes a start was all you needed to set something much larger in motion. As they sat together, sipping tea in the quiet of his office, Ethan felt a sense of peace. His mother's presence reminded him that, despite all the challenges, he wasn't alone in this fight. His family was with him, and the legacy he was building was something that would benefit not just him, but future generations as well. The following week, Ethan received a call from Karen McNeil. The company's Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board had been impressed with Ethan's leadership and wanted him to take on an expanded role. They were offering him a permanent position on the board, not just as a consultant, but as a key decision-maker. This would give him the authority to influence policies across the entire airline industry. Ethan sat at his desk, listening to Karen's proposal, his mind racing with the possibilities. This was a huge opportunity, one that could allow him to push for even more systemic changes within the airline industry. But it also came with its own challenges. Taking on a permanent role would mean more time, more responsibility, and more public scrutiny. Was he ready for that? "Ethan, I know this is a big ask," Karen said, her voice sincere. but the work you've done so far has been groundbreaking. We need someone like you who truly understands what it takes to create meaningful change." Ethan paused, weighing the decision carefully. Part of him wanted to jump at the opportunity, but another part of him that had grown weary from the constant fight was hesitant. He had already invested so much time and energy into Sky North, and he was starting to feel the toll it had taken on him. Could he keep going at this pace? "You'll need some time to think about it," Ethan said finally, his voice steady. Karen didn't push. "Take all the time you need, but just know that we'd be lucky to have you." As the call ended, Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring out the window. He knew that this decision wasn't just about him. It was about the future of the industry and the people who worked within it. The path ahead was clear, but it was also daunting. He had to decide if he was ready to take on that level of responsibility. That evening, Ethan decided to visit his father, Malcolm Carter, at the family's estate. The sprawling mansion had always felt more like Malcolm's domain than Ethan's monument to the elder Carter's success. But today, as Ethan walked through the familiar halls, he felt a sense of calm rather than intimidation. Malcolm was sitting in his study, a glass of scotch in hand, when Ethan entered. The room was filled with bookshelves, business awards, and framed photos of Malcolm with various industry leaders. It was a testament to the life Malcolm had built, a life Ethan had spent years trying to distance himself from. "Ethan," Malcolm said, standing up to greet his son. "Good to see you. How's everything at Sky North?" Ethan smiled, taking a seat across from his father. "Busy," he replied. "But good." Malcolm studied his son for a moment, sensing that there was more on his mind. "Something's bothering you," he observed. "You want to talk about it?" Ethan took a deep breath, then launched into a recap of his conversation with Karen and the offer to take on a permanent role at Sky North. As he spoke, Malcolm listened intently, his expression thoughtful. When Ethan finished, Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "It sounds like a huge opportunity," he said, "but I can see why you're hesitant." Ethan nodded. "I've already put so much into this, and I know I can do more. But at the same time, I'm not sure if I'm ready to make this my whole life." Malcolm was silent for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "You've done something incredible, Ethan. You've made a real impact, not just at Sky North, but across the industry. But I think the most important thing is that you find balance. You've always been driven, just like me, but you also need to know when to step back and take care of yourself."
Ethan looked at his father, surprised by the vulnerability in his words.
Malcolm had always been the embodiment of hard work and success, but this was the first time he had seen his father acknowledge the importance of balance. "I've made mistakes," Malcolm continued, his voice softer now. "I pushed too hard for too long, and I missed out on things I can't get back. I don't want that for you." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. For years, he had been trying to prove that he didn't need his father's approval, that he could build a career on his own terms. But now, sitting here with Malcolm, he realized that his father's wisdom was something he needed to embrace, not resist. "I appreciate that, Dad," Ethan said quietly. "I just want to make sure I'm doing the right thing." Malcolm smiled, setting down his glass. "You're already doing the right thing, Ethan. You've always known what's best for you. Trust yourself." The conversation with his father left Ethan with a new sense of clarity. He realized that the decision he faced wasn't about choosing between success and personal well-being. It was about finding a way to achieve both. He could continue his work at Sky North, but he didn't have to let it consume him. The next morning, Ethan called Karen to discuss the offer. He wasn't going to accept the permanent role on the advisory board, not yet, at least. Instead, he proposed a middle ground. He would continue to work with Sky North on key initiatives, but he wouldn't commit to a full-time position. This would give him the flexibility to pursue other projects and maintain a healthier balance between work and his personal life. Karen was more than understanding. "Ethan, we're grateful for any involvement you're willing to offer. You've already done so much for us, and we want to make sure you're able to keep doing it without burning out." With that decision made, Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He could still make an impact, but on his own terms. It was the balance he had been searching for all along. In the months that followed, Ethan continued his work with Sky North, helping to implement new policies and programs that promoted diversity and inclusion across the company. But his involvement extended beyond just Sky North. Other airlines and businesses in various industries began to take notice of the changes happening at the airline. And soon, Ethan found himself being asked to consult on diversity initiatives for other companies. Ethan had never imagined himself becoming an industry leader in this space, but now he embraced the role with open arms. He had found his purpose, not just in making deals and climbing the corporate ladder, but in creating environments where people from all backgrounds could thrive. His work began to ripple across industries. Companies were adopting similar initiatives. Employees were speaking out about their experiences with bias, and corporate cultures were slowly starting to shift. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a steady, meaningful change. One day, Ethan received an unexpected email from Emily Davis, the flight attendant whose actions had sparked his journey at Sky North. She was now working in a different role within the company, focusing on internal training and diversity programs. The email was brief, but it carried weight. Emily Davis, I'd like to meet. There are things I want to say in person. I hope you'll consider it. Ethan hesitated. He had moved on from the incident, but part of him was curious. Emily had been the catalyst for so much change both in his life and within Sky North. Perhaps this meeting could bring closure. They met at a cafe in New York a week later. Emily arrived first, looking more composed than the last time Ethan had seen her. When he sat down across from her, she smiled nervously, clearly unsure of how to start. Ethan, I just want to thank you for everything you've done, Emily began. Not just for the company, but for me personally. That day on the plane, I made assumptions about you that were completely unfair. I didn't realize how deeply ingrained my biases were until I went through the training and started working with the diversity team. Ethan listened, feeling a mix of emotions. He had already forgiven her in his heart, but hearing her acknowledge her mistakes out loud brought a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. I'm not the same person I was back then, Emily continued, her voice steady. I've learned a lot, and I am still learning. But I just wanted you to know that I'm committed to making sure what happened between us never happens to anyone else. Ethan smiled, genuinely appreciating her honesty. I'm glad to hear that, Emily. We've all got things to work on, and the important thing is that you're trying to change. As they parted ways, Ethan felt a sense of peace. The journey had come full circle. What had started as a painful experience had evolved into something that had not only changed his life, but had sparked a movement of change within Sky North and beyond. Months later, Ethan stood at the front of a conference room, addressing a group of young professionals who had gathered for a leadership summit. He had been invited to speak about his journey, about the challenges he had faced, the lessons he had learned, and the legacy he was building. As he looked out at the faces in the audience, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. These young leaders were the future, and they were hungry for the kind of change Ethan had spent his career fighting for. They wanted to create workplaces that valued diversity, inclusion, and respect for all employees, regardless of their background. Leadership isn't just about climbing to the top, Ethan said, his voice strong and confident. It's about lifting others up with you. It's about creating a culture where everyone has the opportunity to succeed, where everyone's voice is heard. The room was silent as Ethan shared his story, from the incident on the plane to his work at Sky North and the impact it had on the industry. He spoke about the challenges he had faced, the resistance he had encountered, and the victories, both big and small, that had made the fight worth it. As he finished, the audience erupted into applause. But Ethan wasn't thinking about the applause. He was thinking about the future, the work that still needed to be done, the conversations that still needed to happen. He wasn't just Malcolm Carter's son anymore. He was Ethan Carter, a man who had built his own legacy, one rooted in the values of fairness, respect, and inclusion. And he knew that this was only the beginning. As the sun set over Dallas, Ethan stood on the balcony of his apartment, looking out at the city that had been his home for so many years. The journey he had embarked on had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. It had tested him, pushed him to his limits, and forced him to grow in ways he never imagined. But now, as he stood there, he felt a sense of peace. He had found his purpose not in following his father's footsteps, but in forging his own path, one that was grounded in his values and driven by a desire to make the world a better place. His phone buzzed with a message. It was from his father. "Malcolm Carter, proud of you, son. You've done something incredible. This is your legacy." Ethan smiled as he typed out a reply. "Ethan Carter. Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done it without you." As he put his phone away and looked out at the horizon, Ethan knew that his journey was far from over. There was still so much more to do, so many more battles to fight. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to take on whatever came next. He wasn't just building a career. He was building a legacy, one that would last long after he was gone. And this was only the beginning. It appears we've reached a natural conclusion to the story of Legacy Unseen. However, if you'd like to extend the narrative further, we can explore various avenues, such as Ethan Carter's future challenges in maintaining his legacy, the impact of his work beyond Sky North, or even diving deeper into the lives of supporting characters like Malcolm Carter or Emily Davis. For the sake of continuity and expanding on the story without violating any policies, I'll now create an epilogue to provide additional closure and potential opportunities for further stories. Ethan Carter stood at the edge of the stage, watching as the audience gathered for the opening keynote of the annual Global Diversity Summit in New York City. The past year had been a whirlwind, countless meetings, speeches, interviews, and a growing influence that had far exceeded even his own expectations. But today felt different. Today, he wasn't just another speaker today. He was being recognized as one of the key figures driving change across multiple industries. The conference hall buzzed with excitement as people from all walks of life took their seats. CEOs, activists, employees, and scholars had come together, eager to discuss and collaborate on ways to further diversity, inclusion, and equity within the corporate world. Ethan had been invited to deliver the closing address, a testament to how much his role had expanded since his first steps into advocacy at Sky North Airlines. Ethan took a deep breath, scanning the room. He knew some of the faces in the audience, colleagues, old friends, and new partners who had joined him in the fight for change. But there were also many people he didn't know, people who had been inspired by the work he had done. It was humbling and a little overwhelming. But most of all, it was a reminder of why he had started this journey in the first place. After stepping back from a full-time position on Sky North's advisory board, Ethan had made it his mission to take his message further. He had consulted for other airlines, advised major corporations in finance, tech, and manufacturing, and worked with government organizations to help shape policies around workplace equality. His approach was pragmatic, but always grounded in the values he had come to hold dear: fairness, respect, and inclusion for all. He had also written a book, Redefining Leadership: The Future of Inclusion, which became a bestseller in the business world. It was part memoir, part manifesto detailing his own journey and offering a roadmap for other leaders who wanted to create cultures of inclusivity within their organizations. The book had opened doors he hadn't even known existed. Invitations poured in from across the world to speak at conferences, advise on diversity councils, and mentor rising leaders. But for all the success, Ethan remained grounded, knowing that the real work was in the everyday conversations and the small steps people took to challenge the biases that had become so deeply embedded in society. The impact of his work was beginning to ripple outward, but it wasn't always easy. While there were many who supported him, there were also critics, people who saw his initiatives as a threat to tradition or questioned the necessity of such drastic changes in the workplace. But Ethan had learned how to navigate that criticism with grace, choosing to focus on the people who stood to benefit from the changes rather than those who resisted them. On the personal front, Ethan had grown closer to his family. His relationship with his father, Malcolm Carter, had evolved into one of mutual respect. They no longer saw each other as competitors or as father and son with diverging views. Instead, they had come to understand that their respective legacies, while different, were rooted in the same values: perseverance, hard work, and a commitment to making the world a better place. Ethan had also reconnected with friends he hadn't spoken to in years, and his support system grew beyond just his family. Jessica Hill, the former flight attendant who had initially reached out to him, had become one of his closest allies. She had followed a similar path, taking on a leadership role at another airline where she worked to implement similar diversity initiatives. Their friendship had deepened over time, and together they often collaborated on new projects and programs. And then there was Emily Davis. Her journey of personal reflection and growth had led her to become an advocate for change within Sky North. She had committed herself to making sure no one else experienced what Ethan had gone through, and her work within the airline's diversity team was already making a significant difference. It was a story of redemption, one that Ethan hadn't expected but was grateful for. They still spoke occasionally, and while they weren't exactly friends, there was a shared understanding between them. The experience had transformed them both, each in different ways, and their paths, while initially crossing under tense circumstance, had ultimately led to growth. As the lights in the conference hall dimmed and the murmur of voices quieted, Ethan's thoughts snapped back to the present. His name was announced, and a wave of applause followed him as he walked onto the stage. He paused for a moment, taking in the energy of the room before stepping up to the microphone. "Good evening," Ethan began, his voice steady and confident. "When I started on this journey, I didn't know where it would lead. What began as a personal experience, a moment of feeling out of place, unseen and unheard, became the catalyst for something far greater than I ever imagined." He looked out over the audience, scanning the faces of people who had come from different industries, backgrounds, and countries. But this isn't just my story. It's the story of countless other people who have felt marginalized, overlooked, or judged not for their abilities, but for the way they look, where they come from, or who they love. Ethan paused, letting his words sink in. "We've made progress, and that's worth celebrating. But we still have a long way to go. The work of inclusion is never finished. It's an ongoing process. It's about the choices we make every day, in the boardroom, in the office, and in our communities." The audience was silent, listening intently. Each of us has a role to play in shaping the future of our workplaces and our society. And it's not just about policies or programs. It's about creating a culture where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued. A culture where differences aren't just tolerated, they're celebrated. Ethan's voice grew stronger, more impassioned as he continued. "We have the power to shape the future, to create environments where everyone can thrive. But that requires commitment. It requires us to look at ourselves, our biases, and our systems, and ask, is this the best we can do? And if the answer is no, we have to be brave enough to change it." As he wrapped up his speech, the applause was thunderous, but Ethan wasn't focused on the applause. He was focused on the work that still lay ahead, the future leaders who would continue the fight, the systems that needed to be overhauled, and the individuals who would step up to push for progress. Ethan knew that his role had changed. He had built a legacy. Yes, but now it was about planting seeds for others to take that legacy even further. Later that evening, Ethan found himself standing on the rooftop of his hotel, looking out over the New York skyline. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and the cool breeze brought a sense of calm. His phone buzzed with another message. This time it was from Karen McNeil. "Karen McNeil. Congratulations, Ethan. You've made us all proud. Let's talk soon about our next steps. I have some exciting ideas for where we can take this movement." Ethan smiled, feeling the warmth of Karen's words. He replied with a simple, "Looking forward to it." As he slipped his phone back into his pocket, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. His journey wasn't over, it was evolving. The world was changing, slowly but surely, and he was playing a part in that transformation. For years, Ethan had wrestled with his identity, with the weight of being Malcolm Carter's son, with the pressure of building his own legacy. But now he understood that legacies weren't static, they were dynamic, ever-growing. And as long as he stayed true to his values, he knew he was on the right path. The night stretched on, full of promise and potential. And as Ethan gazed out at the city below, he couldn't help but feel excited for the future, for the challenges, the victories, and the continued fight for a world where everyone, no matter who they were, could rise to their full potential. This was his legacy, and it was just the beginning. As Ethan gazed out at the city below, he couldn't help but feel excited for the future, for the challenges, the victories, and the continued fight for a world where everyone, no matter who they were, could rise to their full potential. This was his legacy, and it was just the beginning. If you've enjoyed this story of Ethan's journey toward leadership and change, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more inspiring stories like this one. Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below together. We can keep the conversation about diversity and inclusion going. I was thinking about it too, James said, his voice quiet but reflective. It feels like so much has happened. But at the same time, it's hard to believe how far we've come. Mildred nodded, her eyes misting over with emotion. I never thought I'd live to see the day when this town could change like this. For so long it felt like we were stuck. But you showed us something different. You showed us that we could be better. James felt a lump form in his throat. I didn't do it alone, Mildred. It's been all of us. People like you, Rachel, Emily, Tommy even. Mildred chuckled softly. Maybe, but we all needed someone to remind us what we were capable of. That's what you did, James. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the sunset over the park. It was a quiet, reflective moment, one that reminded James of why he had stayed, why he had chosen to fight for this town. It's not over, James said, more to himself than to Mildred. There's still work to be done. There's always more to be done, Mildred replied with a knowing smile. But you've given this town something it didn't have before: hope. Meanwhile, Emily Green had been working on her biggest story yet. The pieces she had written for the local paper had caught the attention of a national magazine, and they had commissioned her to write a long-form feature about the transformation of Hollow Creek. She had spent months interviewing people: James, Tommy, Rachel, Sheriff Nate Johnson, and countless others. She poured her heart into the article, determined to capture the essence of what had happened in this small town. It wasn't just a story about racism or a fight for equality. It was about community, about resilience, about the power of one person's actions to ignite change. When the feature was published, it was an instant success. Readers from across the country were moved by the story of Hollow Creek, and Emily was flooded with messages of support. People wanted to know more. How had the town done it? How could they replicate that success in their own communities? For Emily, it was a deeply personal victory. She had grown up in Hollow Creek, and for a long time, she hadn't believed that the town could change. But now, as she read the responses to her article, she knew that anything was possible. The next spring, the first integrated class graduated from Hollow Creek High School. It was a historic moment, not just for the students, but for the entire town. The graduation ceremony was held in the town square, and the entire community showed up to celebrate. James was there, sitting in the front row with Mildred, Tommy, and Rachel, all of them beaming with pride. Lily Sanders, Mildred's granddaughter, gave the valedictory speech, speaking eloquently about the future, about unity, and about the lessons they had learned from the town's struggles. We are the generation that will carry this town forward, Lily said, her voice clear and strong, and we will do it together. Because we've learned that we are stronger when we stand as one. The crowd erupted into applause, and as the graduates tossed their caps into the air, there was a sense of triumph, of new beginnings. Hollow Creek had come so far, and now a new generation was ready to take the reins. As the town continued to grow and change, Harold Brooks made a surprising announcement. He was bringing back the name Rose's Diner. But this time, the name would reflect something different. Harold stood outside the diner, addressing a small crowd of onlookers. James, Mildred, and the rest of the diner's regulars were there, curious about the announcement. Rose's Diner was named after my mother, Harold began, his voice filled with emotion. She was a kind woman, a woman who believed in treating everyone with respect. But somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. We let this place become a symbol of division. Harold paused, glancing at James, who gave him an encouraging nod. But now I want to reclaim that name, Harold continued. This diner is going to stand for something new, something my mother would be proud of. It's going to be a place where everyone is welcome, where everyone has a seat at the table. The crowd cheered, and as the new sign for Rose's Diner was unveiled, it felt like a fitting tribute to the town's journey. As summer approached, Rachel Morales prepared to leave Hollow Creek once again, this time for good. Her work had taken her to other towns and cities, and while she had grown deeply attached to Hollow Creek, she knew it was time to move on. On her last night in town, she gathered with James, Emily, and the others at Rose's Diner for one final meal. The atmosphere was warm and nostalgic, filled with laughter and shared memories. "I'm going to miss this place," Rachel admitted as she sipped her coffee. "But I know you all are going to keep the momentum going." "Well, miss you too, Rachel," James said, smiling warmly. "But don't worry, we've got this." They spent the rest of the evening reminiscing about the town's journey, about how far they had come, and about the road that still lay ahead. When it was time to say goodbye, there were hugs, tears, and promises to keep in touch. But as Rachel drove away from Hollow Creek the next morning, she left knowing that the town was in good hands. Several months after Rachel's departure, James received a letter from her. He sat on his porch, the autumn air crisp and cool, as he read her words. "Dear James, I hope this letter finds you well. I've been thinking about Hollow Creek a lot lately, and I wanted to check in. I've been working with a community out west, and it reminds me so much of where Hollow Creek was when I first arrived. But seeing the progress we made gives me hope that change is possible, no matter where you are. I just wanted to thank you once again for everything you've done for the town and for me. You've taught me so much about patience, about perseverance, and about how change really happens. You'll never forget our time together. Take care of yourself, James, and take care of Hollow Creek. With gratitude, Rachel." James smiled as he folded the letter, tucking it into his pocket. Rachel's words were a reminder that their work was far from over, but it was also a reminder of how much they had already accomplished. Over time, Tommy Barnes fully embraced his role as a leader in the town's new direction. He became a regular volunteer at the community center, working with young people who, like him, had once been resistant to change. One afternoon, as Tommy sat on a bench outside the center, talking with a group of teenagers, he realized just how far he had come. The anger and fear that had once controlled him were gone, replaced by a sense of purpose. "I used to think change was something to be afraid of," Tommy told the teens. "But now I see it's what makes us better. We can't grow if we don't open ourselves up to new ways of thinking." The teens listened intently, nodding in agreement. Tommy's journey had become an inspiration to many, showing that it was never too late to change. 1 year after the March for Unity, the town of Hollow Creek came together once again to celebrate. The town square was filled with music, food, and laughter, as people from all walks of life gathered to reflect on the progress they had made. James stood with Sheriff Nate Johnson, Emily Green, and Lily Sanders, watching the festivities with a deep sense of pride. The town was thriving, its people united by a shared vision of a better future. As the sun set over the town, casting a golden glow over the square, James felt a quiet sense of contentment. Hollow Creek had been through so much, but they had come out the other side stronger, more resilient, and more united than ever. In the years that followed, Hollow Creek continued to evolve. The town's story became a beacon of hope for other communities struggling with their own divisions. People came from far and wide to visit Rose's Diner, to see the mural painted by the teenagers, and to meet the people who had made change possible. But for James, it wasn't about the recognition. It wasn't about being a hero or a leader. It was about the quiet, steady work of building a community where everyone had a place. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the stars twinkle above the town, James felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that the fight for justice was ongoing, that there would always be more work to do. But for now, in this moment, he was content. Hollow Creek was his home, and it was a home worth fighting for. As the story of James and Hollow Creek shows, change takes courage, community, and a willingness to stand up for what's right. If you've been inspired by their journey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that remind us of the importance of unity, justice, and hope. And remember, your voice matters. Let us know in the comments how this story touched you and what kind of stories you'd love to hear next. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. It's still hard sometimes, but I feel like we're finally free. Edith smiled, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel. She had come so far, and though there were still challenges ahead, Edith knew that Rachel had the strength to face them. "I'm so proud of you," Edith said softly. "You're doing such a good job, Rachel. You and the girls are going to be just fine." Rachel hesitated for a moment, then her voice softened. "We couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You saved us. I'll never be able to thank you enough for everything you've done." Tears welled in Edith's eyes, and she wiped them away with a smile. "You're family now, Rachel, and family takes care of each other." As Edith hung up the phone, a sense of calm settled over her. She had faced her fears, stood up to Derek, and helped Rachel and the girls escape a dangerous situation. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Her home, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a symbol of strength and resilience. And her neighbors' sons, strangers, had become a community, united by a shared sense of purpose. Life on Cedar Street would never be the same again, but that was okay. Because now it is filled with hope, connection, and the promise of a better future. Edith smiled as she stepped out into her garden, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the roses. She knelt down, her hands gently tending to the flowers, feeling the cool earth beneath her fingertips. There was still work to be done, but now she knew she wasn't doing it alone. In the weeks that followed Derek's final confrontation, a new sense of peace settled over Cedar Street. The neighborhood watch remained vigilant, but the need for constant worry had lessened as Derek's presence faded from their lives. He hadn't returned, and the restraining order kept him at a safe distance from Edith's home and from the shelter where Rachel and the girls were living. Edith found herself breathing easier with each passing day, the weight of fear slowly lifting from her shoulders. One crisp autumn morning, as Edith was pruning her roses, she heard the familiar ring of her phone from inside the house. She wiped her hands on her gardening apron and hurried to answer it, her heart lifting when she saw Rachel's name on the caller ID. "Rachel, it's so good to hear from you," Edith said, a smile spreading across her face as she held the phone to her ear. "Hi, Edith," Rachel replied, her voice filled with warmth. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all, dear. Just tending to the garden. How are you and the girls doing?" Rachel let out a small sigh, though it was one of relief rather than stress. "We're doing really well, actually. The girls are starting to settle in at school, and they're making new friends. We've been staying at the shelter for a while now, but I've been working with a caseworker. And, well, we found a place. It's a small apartment, but it's ours." Edith's heart swelled with joy at the news. "Rachel, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. I couldn't have done it without your help, Edith. Really? I mean it. You were there for me when I didn't know what to do. I'll never be able to thank you enough." "You've already thanked me more than enough, Rachel," Edith said gently. "I'm just glad you and the girls are safe and moving forward." "We are," Rachel agreed, her voice steady. "We still have some hard days, but we're starting to rebuild. I'm learning how to live without looking over my shoulder all the time. The girls, they've been through so much, but I think they're going to be okay." Edith felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she wiped it away with a smile. "You're an incredible mother, Rachel. You've given them the chance to have a better life, and that's the most important thing." "Thank you," Rachel whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I wanted to ask, would you like to come visit us when we're settled into the apartment? The girls miss you, and I'd love for you to see our new place." "I'd love that," Edith replied without hesitation. "I can't wait to see how far you've come." After they said their goodbyes, Edith stood in the quiet of her kitchen, a deep sense of pride and peace settling over her. She had been part of something important, helping Rachel and her daughters escape a dangerous situation and start a new life. Knowing that they were safe and thriving gave Edith a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in a long time. But Edith also knew that healing wasn't just for Rachel and the girls. She, too, had been deeply affected by everything that had happened. For so long, Edith had lived in a world of solitude, wrapped in the memories of her past life with Richard. But now she realized that she had the power to create new connections, to make a difference in the lives of others. Her small, quiet world had expanded in ways she never could have predicted. A few weeks later, Edith stood in front of the door to Rachel's new apartment, her heart racing with anticipation. She held a basket filled with homemade cookies and a small potted plant, a housewarming gift for Rachel and the girls. As she knocked on the door, she couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and pride. Rachel had taken such brave steps toward building a new life for herself and her daughters, and Edith was eager to see the progress they had made. The door opened, and there stood Rachel, her face lighting up with a wide smile. "Edith, you made it." "Of course I did," Edith replied warmly, stepping inside and hugging Rachel. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." The apartment was small but cozy, filled with the warmth and light that Edith had come to associate with Rachel. The walls were adorned with colorful artwork, some drawn by Lily and Ivy, and the space felt alive with the energy of a family building something new. Edith smiled as she took it all in, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel's resilience. "Look who's here!" Rachel called out. And moments later, Lily and Ivy came bounding into the room, their faces bright with excitement. "Grandma Edith!" they exclaimed in unison, rushing toward her and wrapping their arms around her. Edith laughed, bending down to hug the girls. "Oh, my dears, it's so good to see you." "We missed you," Ivy said, her voice small but filled with warmth. "Can you stay for dinner?" "I wouldn't dream of leaving before dinner," Edith replied, her heart swelling with affection for the girls. As they settled into the living room, Rachel brought out a pot of tea, and the four of them spent the afternoon catching up, laughing, and sharing stories. The girls proudly showed Edith their artwork, and Rachel talked about how they were adjusting to their new school and making friends. "They're doing so well," Rachel said, her voice filled with relief and pride. "I wasn't sure how they would handle all the changes, but they've been so strong. I'm so proud of them." "You should be proud of yourself too," Edith said gently. "You've created a safe, loving home for them. That's everything." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with tears of gratitude. "I still can't believe we made it. There were times when I thought we'd never get out, but now we have a chance at a real life." As the afternoon turned into evening, the conversation grew deeper, and Edith and Rachel found themselves reflecting on everything that had happened over the past few months. There had been so much pain, fear, and uncertainty, but now there was also hope. They had made it through the storm, and now they were standing on the other side, ready to rebuild their lives. "I never thought I'd feel free," Rachel admitted quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. "But now I wake up every morning knowing that I'm safe, that my girls are safe. And that's everything." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "You deserve this peace, Rachel. You and the girls deserve all the happiness in the world." Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "And you deserve it too, Edith. You've been through so much yourself. You've given us a new start, and I hope you know how much that means to me." Edith smiled, her heart full. "We've given each other a new start." Later that evening, after dinner, and one last round of hugs from Lily and Ivy, Edith said her goodbyes and made her way back to her own home. As she walked down the quiet street, she felt a deep sense of contentment. Life had changed in ways she never could have predicted, but it was better now, richer, fuller, and filled with new connections. Rachel and the girls had become like family to her, and Edith knew that their bond would only grow stronger as they continued to support one another in the days ahead. As the autumn leaves began to fall and the air turned crisp, Edith found herself spending more time in her garden, reflecting on the past few months. So much had changed, not just for Rachel and the girls, but for Edith as well. Her life, once quiet and isolated, had been transformed by the relationships she had built and the strength she had discovered within herself. But with that transformation came a deeper understanding of the weight she had been carrying for so long: grief, the loneliness, the sense of being left behind. Richard's death had left a hole in Edith's life, one that she had tried to fill with routine and solitude. But now, with Rachel and the girls in her life, Edith realized that she didn't have to carry that weight alone anymore. One afternoon, as Edith sat in the garden with a cup of tea, she found herself thinking about Richard. She missed him every day, missed his laugh, his warmth, the way he had always made her feel safe and loved. But for the first time in a long time, Edith felt a sense of peace when she thought of him, peace in knowing that he would have been proud of her for everything she had done to help Rachel and the girls. As she sipped her tea, Edith decided it was time to visit Richard's grave. She hadn't been in a while, and she felt a strong pull to go to tell him about everything that had happened, about the new life she had found after all these years. The next day, Edith drove to the cemetery where Richard was buried. The drive was quiet, the fall colors painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. When she arrived, Edith made her way to Richard's headstone, a small smile on her face as she placed a bouquet of fresh roses at his grave. "Hello, love," she said softly, her voice filled with affection. "It's been a while, but I've been busy. I have so much to tell you." For the next hour, Edith sat by Richard's grave, telling him about Rachel, about the girls, about everything that had happened since they had moved into the neighborhood. She talked about how she had found new strength within herself, how she had made new friends, and how she had learned that it was never too late to make a difference in someone's life. "I think you'd be proud of me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I've still got a lot of life left to live, and I'm going to make the most of it. I'll carry your love with me, always." As Edith stood to leave, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She knew that Richard was still with her, in spirit, and that his love would continue to guide her in the days ahead. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the winter holidays approached, Cedar Street came alive with the warm glow of twinkling lights and the festive spirit of the season. Edith, who had once dreaded the long, lonely winter months, now found herself filled with a sense of anticipation and joy. The neighborhood had changed so much in the past few months, and Edith felt more connected to her community than ever before. Rachel and the girls had invited Edith to spend Christmas with them in their new apartment, and Edith had gladly accepted. It was a far cry from the quiet, solitary holidays she had spent in years past, and she was looking forward to celebrating with people she cared about. On Christmas Eve, Edith arrived at Rachel's apartment with a basket full of gifts and homemade treats. The girls greeted her at the door, their faces bright with excitement, and Edith couldn't help but laugh as they pulled her inside. "We've been waiting for you," Lily exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with joy. Mom made hot chocolate. Edith's heart swelled with affection as she followed the girls into the cozy living room where Rachel was waiting with a warm smile. The apartment was decorated with twinkling lights and a small Christmas tree, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and pine. "Welcome, Edith," Rachel said, hugging her tightly. "We're so glad you're here." "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else," Edith replied, her voice full of warmth. As they sat together by the fire, sipping hot chocolate and exchanging stories, Edith felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what she had been missing for so long, a sense of connection, of belonging, of family. The evening passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and warmth. The girls opened their presents with wide-eyed excitement, and Edith marveled at how far they had come since the dark days of living under Derek's control. They were happy, healthy, and full of life, and Edith knew that Rachel had done an incredible job of creating a safe, loving home for them. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Rachel and Edith sat together by the fire, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Rachel said quietly, her eyes focused on the flickering flames. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it out." "But we did." "You did," Edith corrected gently. "You found the strength to leave, and now you and the girls have a bright future ahead of you." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You were there when I needed someone the most, And I'll never forget that. Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. We've been there for each other, and we'll keep being there, no matter what comes next. As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Edith felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. The storm was over, and now it was time to move forward to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that they had all found the strength to survive and thrive. And in that moment, Edith knew that everything would be all right. Thank you for following along with Edith's emotional and inspiring journey. If you found this story moving or relatable, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more powerful stories like this. We'll be bringing you more heartwarming tales of resilience, community, and the strength of the human spirit. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll always be the first to know when new content is available. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.